Welcome to today's New England Himss webinar, Threat is Real, Risk is Real, Are You Prepared? Presented by Stephen Nardone, CISSP. All lines are muted upon entry today, so please send all questions via the Q&A feature. We will end today's session by looking at the Q&A. With more than 40 years of information security experience, Stephen's areas of expertise include risk governance and oversight, security program development and management, security architecture, solutions development and delivery, security assessment and testing, and security compliance. Please join me in welcoming Stephen today.
Thank you, Elisa, and thanks everybody for joining today. I am, as always, excited to have an opportunity to talk about cybersecurity and information security. And certainly the healthcare industry is an area that is of great concern, just based upon historically what's been happening from an attack perspective and a breach perspective across the industry. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about threat first, and I always like to jump into the conversation and talk about threat and ensure that we have a healthy perspective of what the threat is out there. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how that threat actually leads to compromise. Then we'll jump into risk, and we'll talk a little bit about risk management and the types of things you can do. We'll wrap up the slide presentation with a 10-point plan of what it is that I think are the top focus areas everybody should take away from today's discussion. And then we certainly will we'll wrap up with questions. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. And thinking about healthcare in general, there are a couple of key points that I want to make, right? Number one is from an attacker point of view, data is the new currency, right? We've been hearing this for many years, and the fact that there's a lot of money to be made by getting their hands on sensitive information, right? The dark web or the dark net, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is a treasure trove of this type of information that is available for sale or for use. And so 78 million healthcare records since 2009 is one of the key focus areas of the key data elements that we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind. In 2020, there were 29 million records that were compromised, and we're going to show some other slides that'll give you a little bit more history here. But again, the picture that we're painting is that the interest in healthcare information and the interest in targeting healthcare organizations is going to continue, and it is growing 25% year over year. And one of the key elements, and of course, COVID has been the factor that has really influenced this whole remote worker situation, is that remote workforce and that we're all in at this particular point in time and trying to emerge from has been really the key target for cyber attacks. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about that as we work our way through the presentation today. And again, if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat. We're monitoring the chat, so if there is something significant that we want to make sure we're addressing as I walk through, we will definitely make sure that we cover that. So first area is understanding threat. And just taking a look at some of the statistics, right? If you look at what's happened from a healthcare exposure perspective, data records that have been compromised, one of the key factors here, and this is one of the ones that I've spoken about many years ago when it occurred in 2015, was the number of records that were compromised. And that was Blue Cross Anthem, Excella, Care First, and there are a lot of records that were compromised based upon one particular breach, right, which is Blue Cross Anthem. And you can see here, the profile up and down. We know that we're seeing a significant increase. One of the things that we note in the industry is that there are more breaches that are occurring, but the number of records that are compromised in any particular breach seems to be going down. So we're not seeing, in a lot of cases, the mega breaches that we saw.
Hi, Steve.
Certainly
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes,
your slides are not advancing.
They are not.
They are not. So we are
slide. Okay, let me just cover this real quick again. Stats associated with healthcare breaches, and we are seeing the changes now, right?
yes, we are.
Alrighty, so overall numbers of records that have lost. I did speak to these, but just keep in mind that again, healthcare and healthcare breaches are continuing to grow year over year. This one factor here, 25% year over year growth in breaches, is continuing to occur. And certainly, as I indicated, right, the remote workforce, telemedicine, all kinds of opportunities for cyber attackers to insert themselves into that remote operation is certainly a key concern. So again, looking at the overall numbers of records, right, you can see here in this chart, again, up and down. 2015, as I mentioned, was some very, very significant breaches, as I already spoke to. I won't go over those again. And again, the point I made on this slide is that numbers of breaches are increasing, but the numbers of records that seem to be compromised per breach, per each individual breach, seems to be dropping. And that's actually a good sign, because that means that large scale breaches are not occurring in your organizations. But the threat is still there and will continue to be there and will continue to grow over time. So you probably already know this in the healthcare industry perspective, right? Healthcare records are the most valuable that you can get your hands on. Those individuals that are stealing electronic protected health information or emergency medical record information and posting them on the dark web, unfortunately, are making some pretty good annual salaries associated with that, right? Really, really significant. And the healthcare record is the most prized possession because of the amount of data that's in a healthcare record. So if you think about the amount of information you can get about the individual, all the data associated with their identity, potentially associated with their family, and so on, it really gives you a lot of information to help build, bulletproof identities if you can steal those particular records. And then from an overall length of time perspective, we're going to cover this on another slide as well. But healthcare, again, continues to be at the top of the industry for how long it takes to rectify a breach that occurs. So you can see here, I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but 236 days to be able to identify a breach, right? And 93 days to be able to contain it. Right, total of 329 days, right? You're spending most of the year with a breach in your environment, both in the identification phase as well as the expulsion phase. So it's the sophistication of the attacks, the way the attackers are hiding and staying under the radar is one of the reasons why these things occur. And again, the bad news is that the attackers out there are getting more and more and more sophisticated every single day. And then if you look at it from an overall breakdown of how attacks occur, healthcare a little bit down the stack from, say, technology or transportation, but 50% of breaches are from attacks. And the rest of them are from either misconfiguration or human error. And I'm going to cover that on this next slide here and get into a little more detail. So if you think about this, right, this is sort of the overall standard, right? And it goes back to 2018, but it really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot. And the point that I want to make sure that I make on this slide is that half, a little bit less than half, depending upon what industry you're in, or a little bit more than half of the breaches that occur because of human error or system glitch, right? So these are things that you all have control over. And if you're aware of this particular fact, building process and policy and training to be able to address these particular issues is a control point that you can have some impact on. The hackers that are out there that are going after your organization, if that's 50% of the breaches that are occurring, okay, you are still going to continue to be attacked. In reality, one of the things that I typically say, and have been saying this for many years, by the way, is it's not a matter of if, it's not even a matter of when. You likely have been compromised and you don't know it at this particular point in time. and the amount of time it takes to identify and rectify a breach in your environment really speaks to that fact as well. But what you have to do is essentially build a strategy where you can address this side of the spectrum and essentially on the other side, prepare for the when, right? When the breach does occur. So standards again, right? You're somewhere around 200 days, 70 days associated with how long it takes to mean time to identify, mean time to contain. But ultimately, the key point here is that you're up to high 200s, 300 days, where you're actually trying to identify and/or mitigate a breach in your environment. That's a lot of effort in order to be able to contain that. And one of the best ways to help reduce that, again, is process over here, training, as well as just being prepared and putting in place tools and process and procedures for breach identification. Average cost globally is 3.9 million. Average cost in this country is 8.64 million. And a lot of that is because of the amount of effort it takes to pull together all the information, do all the notifications, and handle all the process. And of course, this is certainly something that speaks to the healthcare industry as well, right? Costs are going to be higher because of the amount of notifications and the potential of data that could have been compromised. And the real daunting figure here is this year, the annual spend for those individuals that have been attacked is going to be somewhere in the area of $6 trillion, right? So this is what those malicious actors are doing out there. They're wreaking a lot of havoc in all of our environments. And just a quick peek at the sort of spread associated with breaches. This is from the HIPAA journal. Most of the attacks are happening against healthcare providers. We see health plan organizations, business associations, and associated and clearinghouses are much less significant. So, this speaks to the fact that the providers out there are the ones that are primarily being sought after. All right, so let's, threat is real, right? And hopefully, right, everybody on the call today understands that threat is something that cannot be ignored. I mean, about the SolarWinds breach, about the recent Microsoft issue and the Exchange issue associated with security, right? There is prominent in our lives is the attacks that are continuing to take place. In fact, SecureWorks just came out. SolarWinds was targeted as Russia because of the signatures and all of the malware identified as Russia. And they've recently identified that China was involved as well, and a different portion of the breach associated with SolarWinds. So all of these state entities, all of these organized groups out there that are creating strategies to come after us from an attack perspective, or if you prefer, right, an information warfare perspective. This is continuing to happen on a regular basis. And understanding that what's happening, right? Being a student of threat is something that is really important. And I will speak to that when we wrap things up. But think about how important it is in your organization to become a student of threat and understand threat so that you can translate that into an action plan of how you can protect your specific environment based on the threat that's out there. So a little bit draconian, right? The intro mentioned that I've been doing this for 40 years, and I can't claim that I've seen everything, but I've seen a lot in those 40 years. And one of the things that has happened, and I have been a former chief security officer, one of the things that I formulated in my perspective of how I do risk management is there is no such thing as intrusion prevention. There is intrusion deterrence, and that's something we should all be focusing on. But if the malicious actor wants to get in, if they really and truly want to get into your enterprise, guaranteed they will find a way, because there are so many different vectors that they can explore. And what we're going to do today is just a quick walkthrough of an anatomy of an attack. I just want to make sure that everybody is thinking about how some of these things actually pan out. And we're going to target, in this particular case, phishing. And so, first of all, there is some type of a malicious server that's out there on the internet that is built, right, for the special purpose of going after an environment. And one of the things that the attackers are doing is they're trolling to try and figure out who they might want to go after, right? And in addition, they're also trolling in general, looking for weaknesses across everybody's infrastructure, right? So your environment is being attacked, thousands of times, or being scanned thousands of times a week, looking for weaknesses in your infrastructure and anything that they might be able to exploit. But in this particular case, right, this is a targeted attack against an organization. And so the malicious actor has identified this as a healthcare organization, is thinking, okay, I'm going to craft a really sophisticated phishing attack, right, to go after this particular environment. And we all know the numbers of phishing attacks that have happened. Phishing attacks have increased over 600% since COVID started. So we know this is a standard attack vector that everybody is using. So they're going to launch their attack, and they've decided they're going to go after a particular individual or particular individuals in the environment. They've crafted the email, they send it to a list of folks. In this particular case, the target is an admin in the environment. And so essentially, as in phishing with an F, right, what you're doing is you're baiting your hook and you're looking for somebody that will take the bait, right? So the user is going to look at this email and is going to have to make a decision. Is this something I should be concerned about, or is it something I shouldn't be concerned about? That's, of course, where the training comes into place. But in this case, the user clicks on a link or clicks on an object and downloads a malicious software to their particular machine. So now that machine is infected. And this happens to be administrator. So, the ability to be able to escalate privilege and be able to do more damage in the environment is something that this user now enjoys. So now what that user is this malicious actor is going to do is got to look for other prey within the environment. So they're going to scan the environment. Again, low and slow under the radar. They have an idea of what the tools are in the environment based upon their searching and their analysis. And so they're looking for something that they can go after, and they find a server out here in the DMZ that is not patched. And what they want to do now is they want to leverage that platform as their attack platform. So the malware is dropped on it. And now what they're going to do is they're going to reach out to the internet, out to their command and control source, this malicious server, and they're going to drop more malware, a more sophisticated package on that server. And they escalate privilege. And now, as you can see, they have a command shell. So they have complete control over this server in this particular environment with root level privileges. And now what are they going to do? Remember, we talked about human error and misconfiguration. Now that's what they're doing. They're looking for things in the environment that may not be configured securely. They're going to look at core switches, they're going to look at other switches. They're looking for ARC tables. They're looking to identify passwords. And as they systematically work through the environment, right, they've identified some weaknesses in the environment. And now what they're going to do is start looking for additional opportunities in the environment. And one of the things that they identify is a system in the imaging and diagnostic area. And this is one of the key things that we find a lot in the security work that we do for healthcare providers. A lot of the things that are in the imaging area are older technology, running older operating systems, and are very susceptible to attack or exploitation. So in this particular case, a system is found, old operating system, not patched, easy to exploit. And so now the attacker is on that particular system. And there could be multiple reasons why attackers are in these environments. One of them is, okay, I want to exfiltrate data to the dark net. So they're stealing whatever patient information they can get off of the system or systems that it connects to, and they're just pushing that out into the dark net. So all that sensitive data is now out there for consumption. And the other thing they may be interested in doing is what further damage can I do in the environment? They have additional, remember they have root privileges in the environment. They start looking around. They find an Active Directory or a domain controller. They compromise that particular controller. And now they're going to, again, this is all done over secure channel 443. Nobody can see what's going on because it's all encrypted. They drop an additional payload in the environment. And the next thing you know, the one thing everybody fears is the ransomware attack happens. So, they broken in, they targeted systems that had flaws based on human error, misconfiguration. They've leveraged that. They've reached out to the internet. They've dropped additional malware and payloads in the environment. And now successfully, they have stolen information, and then they have disrupted complete operations in this environment. So this is real, right? This happens all the time. And to think about the protections you're putting in place, the malicious actors that are out there are extremely sophisticated, well-trained, and have budgets that are way beyond any of our organization's information security budgets. So they have the wherewithal to create these strategies. But many times the attack happens with very unsophisticated, easy software that's readily available, that they didn't have to spend a lot of development time creating custom stuff that allows them to get in. Then they go sophisticated after that point in time. And once they're in and they're under the wire, they can do whatever they want to do. So hopefully, that all makes sense. And again, we see this all the time in our business. We do a lot of work for all industries from a security perspective. We actually do ethical hacking and red team testing. So we see the weaknesses that are in the environment and the types of things that can be exploited. And a lot of the issues that we find in general are associated with standards, procedures, configurations, configuration management, human error, misconfiguration, that really, if the appropriate process is in place, could significantly reduce the risk in your environment and in any environment. All right, so hopefully that was useful. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about risk management. So we talked about threat and the fact that threat is real, and that healthcare entities, as an example, we know are constantly being scanned and attacked. And so now that you understand that and you understand the mechanisms for how malicious actors are trying to approach breaching all of your organizations, the next thing to do is talk about what can you do about it, right? So from a risk management perspective, this simple process here is something that I always like to make sure that I reinforce a couple principles against. And, one is you want to be down here in these lower two quadrants, right? So risk avoidance, I'm not interesting. We've never been breached. We have a fantastic security perimeter. So therefore, it's unlikely that the attacker will get in. Having a misunderstanding of the substantial nature and capability that these actors have creates a level of risk avoidance. And you definitely don't want to be in this perspective, in this area. And that's why understanding threat, understanding how sophisticated the attackers are. Again, not to belabor this, but in the SolarWinds attack, what they did was they attacked the very mechanism that was used to update the SolarWinds services. And so it was embedded in the system, unforeseen, undetected, until some very sophisticated forensics experts got a chance to take a look at this. And that's pretty scary, right? They call it a supply chain attack. But think about this. The technology you have in your environment could essentially be breached in a similar way. And so that the normal operation that it's doing, the updates and all of that, could be impacted, right? So not understanding threat and trying to avoid that from a risk management perspective is definitely not the way to go. And risk transference, there is a way to be able to transfer risk, but one of the key things I want to talk about here is if the data is yours, right? If you're using a different provider, say you're putting stuff into the cloud, or you have a third party that's managing your organization, um, deciding that they own risk and they're responsible for the protection of your sensitive data is not effective, right? You still own it, and you still need to make sure that they have the appropriate people, process, and technology in place to meet all the standards and compliance that you need to meet. And so, make sure that that's part of your overall strategy. Of course, risk mitigation is a key thing, right? Identifying risk, categorizing it, organize it by criticality, and then putting a remediation or a mitigation plan in place. That's really what risk management is all about. And then risk acceptance is the fact where you say, okay, we're going to have to accept a certain level of risk in order to be able to keep the business operating, because enhanced security that makes the business not operate efficiently is not a good way to go. And those are all things that need to be taken into consideration. So if you think about what you should be doing, right? Simple model here, right? And I'm a big fan of Protect, Detect, React. I actually started working when I was working for the government way back when with information warfare, and sort of the three pillars we talked about was Protect, Detect, React. If you're familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, it's sort of expanded that out, but protection, detection, and reaction is really the key focus. And most of your energy should be put in detection and reaction based upon the figures I showed you about how long malicious actors can be in your environment before you detect and before you respond to what's going on in your environment. So think about all those three components, right? And then what you need to ask yourself is, am I susceptible to an outside attack? And in addition, right, can my internal systems be breached, or have they been already? So this gets into the testing to ensure that you're not susceptible to exploitation. This gets into doing the same thing on the inside, but focusing on the capability to determine, have I already been breached and I just don't know it? And one of the ways to address this is by doing some level of dark web analysis, which I'll talk to in a second. But key component here, right? Not a matter of if, not even a matter of when. You likely have been breached and you just don't know it at this point in time. You need to be thinking about that. You need to be doing everything you can to try and help identify, is that real? And then overall network segmentation. So systems that may be more difficult to put the appropriate protection in, take as my example, imaging systems. Are they sectioned off to the network with tighter security controls? So a breach in one area won't be able to migrate into other areas, right? So that's a key thing to think about. And then the most important thing, we always say employees are the weakest link in the security chain. In the phishing example, right? Would that user have been trained to not click on a malicious object, download malware on their system, and then execute that devastating breach that I showed you in the simple anatomy of an attack example? So testing your overall boundaries, which, by the way, in today's age, right, there really are no significant boundaries, right? Data's everywhere, systems are everywhere. You've got, cloud-based applications, you've got hybrid cloud, you've got multi-cloud, you have on-prem related protection and issues you need to deal with. So the boundaries are broad, and being able to define them and know what you need to do to be able to test against those is one of the tough challenges that IT security or IT people in general have to deal with, but you do need to figure that out. And so, testing wise, vulnerability scanning, ethical hacking, is there a way for me to be able to demonstrate and determine whether or not the malicious actor, if they do target me, will be able to exploit me? definitely critical. Wireless security testing, we see a lot of weaknesses in wireless implementation. There are all kinds of tools out there for doing wireless penetration testing, devices that an attacker could, drop in a bush outside of a hospital and would be able to allow them to be able to infiltrate and do a man-in-the-middle attack on a wireless infrastructure. That's real, very real, right? We can do that, so we know the bad guys can do that. And then when you start thinking about Internet of Things or Internet of Medical Things, the numbers of devices that are connected to the internet in a healthcare environment, you need to determine, are there weaknesses? And we know in general, most IoT devices are not inherently secure. How are you using mobile devices? And are you thinking about device protection and data protection? Social engineering, obviously testing those users, phishing, vishing, physical security, and data security. And then lastly, dark web analysis, which is the ability to be able to look at the dark net with tools and techniques and resources to be able to determine, has data been exfiltrated? So do you see sensitive data? Do you see accounts that may have been compromised? Do you see evidence of keystroke logger information? All of those are things that can be done through dark web analysis. And we actually do this on a regular basis with tools to look for indicators of compromise, to be able to tell our customers, hey, this, this is serious. This may not be a breach, right? But it is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Or some senior level individual we're recognizing has just had their account compromised. Here's their email address, here's their password, right? So that's the type of information you can get from that dark web analysis. And then testing process. This is something that we consistently find is falling behind, right? So a lot of expense and focus on technology. Sometimes there is focus on things like policy and maybe training, but not as much as it really should be in an environment to ensure that you're doing everything you can to put in place the most effective risk management program. So vulnerability and patch management is huge. Having the ability to be able to look for vulnerabilities, patch vulnerabilities, and then use the vulnerability testing tools to determine, have you actually successfully implemented all the security patches, as an example, that needed to be deployed. And of course, employee awareness training, and then overall, from an organizational perspective, thinking about the components that are important: audit and compliance, risk governance. We talked about security awareness training. This is one that we see as a critical issue that typically needs to be addressed in a lot of the customers that we talk to, which is business continuity and disaster recovery. Of course, what we just went through with COVID demonstrated in real life, right, what business continuity is all about. So having an effective plan to be able to address that, and then testing those plans on a regular basis, are really, really important. This is the be all and end all of what one needs to be thinking about security, but there is a security conscience, right, an awareness, a level of understanding that transposes all the way from what I have here, which is the loading dock, to the boardroom, right? So everybody, as part of the overall organization, understands risk and is working and doing their role to help protect risk. So fundamentally, right, if I'm building a plan of what I need to do in an environment to ensure I'm focusing on all those key things that will help keep my environment safe and secure, protected, or at least constructed so that if I am breached, I can respond effectively. This is the list of things that I absolutely would have on my program plan. One of the other things that you need to think about is technology across the spectrum. This is a snapshot of one of the tools that we use frequently. It's a proprietary built tool that we created. But ultimately, looking at all of the technology that you have in your environment, which are these three quadrants, and then risk and compliance, and looking at, how well am I doing there, and creating a profile where you can actually score risk and help create a risk roadmap plan, right? These are the top things I need to address. That's what I'm speaking to here, is there needs to be a process to be able to do this in your environment. And not only that, you have to have the ability to be able to build that roadmap plan that allows you to be able to focus on those key things that you have to do based on risk criticality, right? You don't want to boil the ocean to start. You want to start with the most critical thing and work your way down the stack, right? And the other, which we find quite frequently, is organizations that we interface with are spending money on technology, but never evaluating, is that technology really making me more secure? And that's a key component that a risk manager needs to think about. A tool like this helps you do that. But again, you have to have a strategy for being able to determine, are the things that you're doing really helping you be more secure? And especially if you're in, a very senior level position, a CISO level position, you're demonstrating to senior leadership how well the money that they are giving you to spend is actually influencing your ability to reduce the overall impact, likelihood of breach or impact of breach. So extremely critical. All right, so you're building your program and you're thinking about security. This is pretty rudimentary, but I think it's important to cover here. One of the key focus areas, and I mentioned this earlier, is the ability to be able to understand your business. And I've seen this in many situations where a decision to put in place security controls is based upon what we would say would be best of breed or best practice, because this is the way we need to go. And when those controls are put in place, they actually restrict business operations. And so what happens there, and I've actually worked in a couple of environments where this is actually played out to be true, is really smart people figure out how to work around those controls. And ultimately, the risk that you have and the impact of that is much more significant than if you had just evaluated the best security for a business process first and then implemented that. So know your business. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. Here we go. All right, so security controls must support business process. So you know the business, you've talked to all the business units, you know what's critical to them, how they operate, what tools they use, and so on and so forth. Now you start putting together the controls that are going to provide the right risk protection for those particular business process or business entities. And so you're thinking about policies, you're thinking about business impact analysis, business continuity planning, you're thinking about business operations and so on. If you're doing internal development, you're thinking about DevOps and SecDevOps and those types of things. But you're building that overall strategy. Once the strategy is complete, IT is going to implement that overall infrastructure, right? And then what you're going to do is you're going to validate whether or not the infrastructure is meeting all of the specific requirements you have for whatever compliance you have to meet, right? In a hospital environment, typically HIPAA, PCI for processing, in some cases GDPR, could be California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. So there are a lot of things that you need to make sure that you're adhering to. But the most important point about this, it's a rudimentary process, is this isn't a one and done. This continues on a regular basis. Reevaluation, right? Looking at the business changes, looking at policies and controls that need to change, making sure that IT is implementing the appropriate systems and then validating that with some type of security verification and then starting over again, right? This is what your InfoSec teams should be doing in your environment. All right, so one of the things that that will be a takeaway here when we get to the 10-point plan is selecting a security framework. And quite frankly, in a lot of conversations that we have with our customers, they're trying to do what would be considered best practice security, but they don't really have a model for what they're trying to achieve. And most importantly, how to measure success. That's really the most important component here, is how do I know when I've gotten there? So there are a lot of different models that can be used, right? We see across the spectrum, NIST 853, which is a security framework. We see ISO 27001 and 2 as a framework. We see a lot of organizations looking, to CSI for their overall structure. And of course, we see organizations that think about the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CSF. And the reason why that I focused on this one is that it sort of really fits well into the protect, detect, react model that we embrace at Connection when we're working with our customers to discern, design, deploy, manage, assess, test environments across the spectrum. And so I don't want to go into each of the components that are here, but I do want to talk about a couple of things that are really, really important. And as a risk owner, asset identification is super, super critical. So if you don't know what assets you have in your environment that you are responsible to protect, then you're missing the boat, right? And so there are a lot of different ways to do, asset inventory systems. You could do vulnerability scanning management systems that create asset inventories. You do patch management systems that also do asset management as well. But it's really a core component to understand what are your assets in the environment. And then once you know what the assets are, the other process, of course, is the vulnerability management that I've talked about. Constant scanning, looking for flaws in system configuration or in patches, and then having a very effective patch management plan to be able to ensure that you're keeping up with all of that, right? So those are sort of at the high level, sort of the three things that I always start with. But here again, right, you're thinking about all these various components. And as you're building your strategy, right, are you doing risk assessments? What are you doing with access control? Do you have an awareness and training program? How are you addressing data security, right? Do you have continuous monitoring of your security? Do you have detection processes, right? So that's the preparing for the when. What is your plan for response? Some CISOs will say the most important plan that I have to build is my incident response plan. It is definitely critical that you know how you're going to respond to an event and then how you're going to recover. So, things like business continuity and disaster recovery come into play here. But basically, with this overall framework and what the CSF allows you to do is to be able to assess and document where you are at a level with each one of these components, level 1 through 5, and then figure out what your maturity level may be and what you want to achieve, right? Not saying the CSF is the only way to go, but having a framework and measuring your risk and assessing your risk against a framework is definitely a critical component. So let's jump into our 10-point plan. So as we talked about before, right, number one for me, and one of the big messages I would like you to take away today, unless this is something that's like, oh no, this is a no-brainer, is become a student of threat. And what does that mean? Understand what's going out there in that big, bad, ugly world. Make sure that you're either getting feeds from threat services that are available to you, or that you have resources that are constantly out there looking for what is the latest breach. What healthcare organization may have just been breached? How did that breach execute? And then once you understand that, you can take a step back and say, what if it were us, all right? What would we have done? In fact, I've talked to some healthcare organizations that actually war game against that, right? If that breach were to happen, what would we have done? Do we have the appropriate protection, detection, and reaction in place to be able to address that? But that's what being a student of threat means. Know what's going on and be thinking about your overall strategy. And then once you do that, you can reduce your threat exposure. So if you know, as an example, and this happens, let's just say for the sake of argument, with social engineering testing, if you know that one of your largest threats and the risk associated with that is a phishing attack, make sure you're focusing on strategy to reduce the overall risk and impact of a phishing attack, right? Reducing your overall threat exposure. And I mentioned select a risk management framework. Make sure that you have one. You can build your own, or you can, take and cobble together from all the various frameworks what you'd like to do. I've done that before in my role. Or you can use something like the CSF or Center for Internet Security or whatever. But make sure you select a framework and you know what you're measuring yourself against, so you know what success looks like. Frequently assess your entire security ecosystem. So this gets back to what I said about the fact that there are really no boundaries anymore. What is your ecosystem? You've got services in the cloud, you've got data in the cloud, you have supply chain or partner relationships with other entities. Data can be anywhere at any given point in time. How do you assess and understand that whole ecosystem and put in place a risk management plan that addresses that whole ecosystem? And then actively measure risks. I can't emphasize this enough, right? So things like dark web analysis. Is there indications out there that I may have been compromised in some form? Active penetration testing or red team testing, inside, outside, social engineering testing to make sure that you understand the weaknesses of the humans. We now call them human firewalls. So think about that, right? A firewall has policy and has controls, and you constantly measure whether or not those policies and controls are effective. Do the same thing with your employees, right? Check those human policies by social engineering testing. Application security, right? If you're exposing apps, are they secure? And are you really testing to ensure that there's no way that data could be leaked or exfiltrated from an app? And then what is your data security strategy? Do you know where your data is? How is it protected? How is it transported? All of that information is really, really important. Think about this. It was several years ago. We think about electronic data. One of a significant breach that happened, and it was out of California, was a vehicle was transporting like 400,000 healthcare records, and it got into an accident, and all those records were strewn all over the place. So physical data, right? The fact that it was then available, we don't really think about that, but that's certainly something you think about with your data security strategy. And then what's most important, rinse and repeat. That I mean frequent testing, because threat changes on a regular basis. Your risk to that threat changes on a regular basis. Make sure you're paying attention to that. And then test your process and policy. Is it effective? You can have a third party come in and review that, or you can, build an internal panel, a steering committee to do that. But make sure you're thinking about process and policy. As I indicated on one of my previous slides, that's an area that usually has weaknesses. And of course, business continuity and disaster recovery, ensuring that your plans work. And then, you can do tabletop exercises or war gaming, as I indicated before, to make sure that you're paying attention to how you would react to certain situations. Increase your level of security education and awareness. Again, make sure you're measuring the capability of your employees and that you have a program, right? So this is addressing the fact that you're not just doing phishing testing or social engineering testing. You have a defined program that allows you to be able to systematically educate and make sure your employees are aware of that. When I worked for an intelligence agency, and the amount of security awareness, education, and training was basically just constant, right? So, incredibly important that you think about that. And also measuring how successful you are. Is it really working? Is it sticking? And then enhance your response and recovery capabilities. So this gets back to, preparing for the when, but also paying attention to the fact that you need to have the capability to respond and recover if you haven't been breached and you don't know it. Build an overall protection program and a strategy for this. Pay attention to incident response. And this involves tools and techniques that will allow you to be able to get better visibility in your environment as well, or using a third party for some type of managed security service. And create a risk governance plan and then socialize that plan so that leadership is constantly aware of where your current risk state is, what you need to address 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 this particular year, what you need money-wise and resource-wise to be able to do that, and the successes that are being achieved by executing this overall program, so that leadership is constantly aware of where you are and where you're going, right? So building that strategy is key. And then 24/7/365 management and monitoring, the be all and end all, right? If you have the ability for the critical systems that you have in your environment to have yourself with your own NOC/SOC or a third party constantly evaluating and monitoring that data, that's really the most important thing that you can do to give you constant risk management. I like to call it constant vigilance, right? Somebody's always watching the environment. So with that, I'm going to stop my particular portion here. Hopefully there are some questions that I can answer. Hopefully you found this very useful. Again, I can't emphasize how important it is to understand threat, be a student of threat. I'll even go to the next level, be a student of risk, and make sure that you're focusing on building strategies that allow you to be aware of you may have been compromised and you're not aware of it based on some of the facts and statistics that I presented to you today. So with that, I will stop and thank you very much. Jennifer, any
Thank you,
questions?
Stephen. Yeah, I was just going to say, this is Elisa, sorry. There aren't any questions in the Q&A as of right now, but I did send a reminder to everyone that you do have a few minutes for Q&A, and they could drop those in there if they have any. And I do want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you to our premier sponsor, Connection, for organizing all this and bringing Stephen to us today to present to our membership, and reminding everyone that the CP Himss credit will be sent to the registered attendee. Along with, as you exit today, if you'll give us our feedback on Stephen's presentation and any questions, there's also a space in the survey that you can drop any questions that you might have after the fact for Stephen, along with your contact information. So I don't have any questions at this time, but thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the Connection team for organizing this today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.